Hi everyone and welcome to today's Ask an Expert webinar. We'll be starting in a few minutes, just giving our latecomers a bit more time to log in. And with that, I think we've given people just about enough time to access the GoToWebinar platform. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all, wherever you're joining us from today. This is the second webinar in a three-part series as part of the Effective Interreligious Action in Peacebuilding program. And I know that many of you joined last week and many of you are familiar with my voice, but for those of you who aren't, my name is Jack Farrell. I am the Manager for Partnerships and Strategic Innovation at Search for Common Ground. I'm based in lockdown London, where it is very grey right now, but I'm going to be facilitating today's discussion to bring some light to my day. So who is our expert for today's session? So I am absolutely delighted to welcome Rebecca Herrington. Rebecca is the CEO and Director of Strategic Learning at Headlight Consulting Services. And Rebecca's here to discuss how to adapt your peacebuilding programs to ensure maximum efficiency and effectiveness. Over the last 13 years, Rebecca has helped organizations develop their understanding of their programming, adapt to changing dynamics and data. Now, over the next hour, we're going to discuss topics such as how to use data and evidence to inform decision-making and program adaptation, how to adjust monitoring and evaluation plans to be more use-focused, and leveraging a systems lens to solve complex problems. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who have joined us today. Firstly, this is a discussion, so we want to hear from you. This discussion is being recorded and it will be posted on the DME for Peace Media Gallery and the Alliance for Peacebuilding website, so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion. Secondly, you can submit a question or a comment in one of two ways or both ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard. That will allow you to type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. Prior to each question, we kindly ask that you introduce yourself, who you are, where you're joining from, and what organization you're from, kind of like meeting someone at a disco. So you can submit questions right away. Please get cracking. Rebecca, how's it going? How are you doing?
Good. I'm really happy to join all of you today and to share what I can, what I've learned in my career.
I am really excited, and a few people in the audience might know this, but Rebecca is actually my old boss at Search for Common Ground, and she was the one who hired me to join the DME for Peace platform 5 years ago, and I'm incredibly grateful. So this is a really exciting conversation for me, and it's also kind of full circle too, because Rebecca, you worked on the Effective Interreligious Action and Peacebuilding program back in 2016. I know we were both in Istanbul together with maybe a couple of today's audience members as we worked on sort of how to effectively design, monitor, and evaluate interreligious peacebuilding programs and decipher what made it different from, traditional secular peacebuilding efforts. So as you are connected to the program, and as a few people here might not be familiar with you, Rebecca, could you tell us a bit about yourself and how did you get to where you are today? Could you give us more information about your background?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been quite the journey, but I've been working in this field, like Jack said, for around 13 years. I originally started my career thinking that I would go into the medical professionals, and realized I was skipping all of my classes to go do work in Latin America and spend time in the field, and figured that I might as well make a career out of that. And so I started by working with a lot of startup NGOs, soluciones comunitarias in Guatemala and Nicaragua, and then Newer International in Kenya. Uh, and as for anyone who has worked with younger organizations, you learn a lot really fast. You're often wearing many more than just one hat, and are responsible for some of that creative energy and problem solving that it takes to get something off the ground. And that's where I learned, quite a bit that feeds into my work on a day-to-day basis. I was originally more on the programmatic side of things. A lot of my original work was in micro business design and support, microfinance, and savings clubs, and in the more development, international development sphere. But all the organizations that I was working at in those early years, I would say, okay, well, how are we measuring our project progress? How do we know that we're really serving the community or reaching the people that we want to reach? How do we know that the services are really meeting a need? And again, as those of you who have worked for small organizations will know, the answer was, that's a great question. Why don't you go figure it out and measure it? And so I had the privilege to kind of learn on the job and on my feet. How do we capture and better understand the social impact and the behavior change that we were trying to do from a very local, beneficiary oriented perspective of really understanding the needs and the benefits from those that we were trying to serve. And that led into my work in Kenya with Newer International, and really helping them build some of the monitoring and evaluation, and look at adaptation. I paused the program that I was leading 3 months into starting that job, when I realized that there was a huge disconnect between the model that we were initially using and the population that we were serving. We were originally approaching it with a more traditional loan model, and when you're working with the extreme poor, that doesn't fit. It's not sustainable. It doesn't meet their needs. And so realizing from early on that adaptation often stems from realizing that we're missing the mark, and doing our best to figure out with those that we're trying to serve and partner with, how to better target what we're doing and better respond to actual need. And that led me to, I experienced quite a number of incidents of violence and just community tension in my early career. And so then I pursued a dual master's at Brandeis University in nearby Boston in the United States, in coexistence and conflict management and sustainable international development, and really then moved my career to look at the nexus between peace building and international development and how they can feed into one another, be integrated in the ways that we do programming, how to make sure that all of our programming is conflict sensitive, and that has just continued to really push forward my career in looking at complexity. And whenever we're looking at complexity, we need kind of more information, whether it's formal or informal data, and where we're pulling that information from, and learn to adapt to rapidly evolving context. And that's mostly what I work on today. Today, I'm CEO of Headlight, as Jack said, but I also lead a lot of our technical practice with our clients, and we work on a lot of strategy design, program design, supported by monitoring, evaluation, and learning, a whole lot of learning, to help us better understand, what we're doing in complexity, what's working, what's not working, and how we can do better day by day. Yeah, so that's where you all find me today, working in Ethiopia and South Sudan, and with a lot of different USAID offices and in the private sector. I work on a pretty diverse portfolio, and that enables me to share a lot of lessons learned from people who are looking at things from a bunch of different lenses, and be able to value and integrate into the work, you know, how we see things through different lenses, and how that, you know, is just different pieces of the puzzle to understanding how we can affect change in the world.
Great. Well, Rebecca, like I said, I think your background speaks for itself. And one thing that you taught me, I think one of my first couple of weeks search was, as a communications person joining an evaluation team, it was like evidence-based decision making. If I made a decision on like a reason for a communications outreach or marketing plan, why did you do that? You know, that sort of having the sort of every decision grounded in sort of some element of data or some evidence or some material that we're building on was so important. And it's something that I try to sort of stick to every single day across all parts of my job. So that's stuck with me. And I'm sure there are going to be plenty of nuggets today that stick with people. So understanding, Rebecca, that you work with many different organizations, both in the private sector and the NGO community, what are the main issues that you see when you work with NGOs when it comes to adapting programming?
Great question. And I have kind of three main challenges that I see, or issues, but the first one right out of the gate is definitely making time for adaptation. I think we all operate, and oftentimes under a false pretense of urgency, that everything we're doing should have been done yesterday. And part of this comes with the passion of doing the work that we do, and really trying to affect positive change and better people's lives, you know, our friends, our family, the people we serve and work with. But sometimes that level of urgency actually does more harm than good. And in a rush to try to, you know, implement programming or complete the next task on our list, we may miss out on the signs that, you know, something is amiss, and we're not really having the impact that we want to. This is only further, you know, this isn't just a problem from the NGO side of things, but is really really influenced and encouraged by how donors interact with us in our work, and this kind of expectation that you have a period of performance and you have agreed upon deliverables, or, you know, metrics, certain levels of output that you need to meet, and then you know, are reporting on those on a regular basis. And there's a really heavy focus on accountability. And I'm not arguing against accountability, but I actually think, you know, there's more accountability to be had in learning and adaptation, and constantly checking whether or not we are effectively working towards the behavior change pathway that we're looking for in our programming, than there is in just meeting a set number of outputs. You know, part of it is the influence of the private sector in our world, and this need to really quantify everything that we're doing. And as we all know, in the peace building space, it can be really hard to quantify a lot of what we're doing. And it doesn't mean we don't measure it and try to find innovative ways to measure it, but it takes a lot more dedication to looking at, you know, indicators from the context, and understanding, and creating feedback loops from those that we're working with, to better understand, you know, what's happening, what's working, and what's not working. And that takes time. It takes time to be reflective. It takes time to listen to the communities that we're working with. And it takes time to figure out, once you have the data, what adaptation to make. And then, you know, moving your programming around and making new decisions, and getting permission from those who hold decision-making authority to make those changes to our activities. And so making time is the first, and I think that's really supported by a lack of resources and buy-in for change. And this can be both housed within NGOs as well as with donors. That making change isn't something that just happens overnight. Oftentimes adaptations have costs associated with them. They certainly require human capacity and capital to get that buy-in, to go out to the communities and ask more questions, to sit down and have those reflective times. That's all time out of people's days. And then buy-in for change that, we haven't quite figured out in the field what is an appropriate threshold of evidence or data to culminate in an adaptation. And that means, all of those conversations take more time as we negotiate that with our partners, our donors, and other people that we're working with. And so, we need to make time, but we also need to negotiate early and often when we're setting up and designing our activities, that we have the resources and buy-in for anticipated adaptations. And the last I'll say is maximizing available data. I think oftentimes people think they either don't have the right data to make adaptations, or they view data that they use for reporting in a very separate space. And I'm all for lowering the burden and the number of resources required for us to embed learning and adaptation into our programming. And part of that is maximizing what we already have. We have a lot of data in the different fields in which we work. And I think, first we need to recognize what all counts as data and better leverage some of the informal information and data streams that we have feeding into our programs, whether that be, after action conversations after we do an activity amongst staff and really capturing and documenting those lessons learned, or whether that be informal conversations with the community, but really leveraging, all of the different data sources that we already have to make the most of it and really apply that to our proactive learning and understanding of when we need to make adaptations.
So Rebecca, one of the things you touched on quite a bit during your answer there was the need to communicate with the donor and start the negotiations early to prepare them for the idea of adaptation. I think nearly everybody who's worked in this field has probably worked on a program that hasn't gone the way they expected, or they've realized the data isn't telling the story that they anticipated. So we've got a question from Bill Flavin, who's a professor at the Army War College. And Bill asks, how do you handle donor expectations? So I guess I build on that, Rebecca, and ask, how do you effectively communicate with donors about, the need to adapt? Is there sort of a best practice in how to approach them with data? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, donors are as varied as implementers are. So, I don't think there's a perfect silver bullet or one size fit all solution, but some practices that I have found useful is really talking about adaptation and the complexity of the context or the programming that's being implemented right during activity design. Being really forthright and making sure that you're establishing mutual expectations and understanding of, hey, if we're doing this program in South Sudan or in a conflict context, can we all agree that, there hasn't been a lot of stability, that there's either been outbreaks of violence that, may influence the safety of folks on our teams to go work in those regions, or, may change the needs of the populations that we're working with. Can we agree that the political situation has been unstable and that there may be changes in laws or policies that could also influence the implementation of our programming. And so I think, right out of the gate, that first conversation when you're doing activity design or negotiating a contract, having a conversation with the donor so that you can agree on that there is a lot of variability to implementation, will help set the stage for more productive conversations around adaptations later on. I think the other thing to do at that first stage is to establish kind of what that threshold is. What does the donor that you're working with consider good enough evidence, right? Because we're not going to be able to do impact evaluations, nor should we, or any, significant overarching evaluative efforts necessarily throughout program implementation. But we want to, make sure that we're being good stewards of the available resources that we do have, and that we're achieving, the desired outcomes. And so we want to adapt sooner rather than later. And can we agree, what's the threshold? Do we need to have a certain number of KIIs? Can it just be observational data? And some donors may find these conversations premature, and I would encourage you to just push through and say, just humor us. We're really trying to be prepared and proactive in the management of the activity, and you should get receptivity from donors on that, and that will help you then know what the threshold is when you're starting to see an emergent issue in program implementation, when to kick off that conversation with a donor, when you're nearing that threshold of something that they've agreed to consider as a serious issue or sufficient data that requires action. And the last thing I would do is recognize that we're still a long way from true valuation of informal data, and even qualitative methods in the field, depending on which donor you're working with. And so making sure that, based on that data threshold conversation you had at the start of the activity, that you're really adhering and listening to what the donor said was good enough evidence, that, if they said that they're not going to take observational data, then, when you're starting to see changes or issues in the context, or the, from any other data source, that you're really, you're really doubling down, looking for key informant interviews, or whatever other data source that you've agreed upon is going to be useful. And again, that takes resources and buy-in. So, making sure that you're just highlighting in whatever regular conversations you might be having with a donor, that, hey, we think we're seeing something, but we're going to build, the evidence, but just a heads up, we're going to be having some additional conversations or trying to pull some additional data to understand, this red flag or this issue that's been, that's increasing in our visibility during implementation.
I think that's a very detailed sort of response, Rebecca, and a couple of really great tips for how to engage donors. There are a couple of things that are standing out to me there. The first is being proactive. It's like, if you're seeing the data, if you're seeing sort of evidence that your program is not working or having negative impacts or consequences in the sort of context within which you're working, it's sort of negligent to not raise that. And despite the sort of traditional view that, donors are restricted and sort of conservative in their willingness to change a program that they've decided to fund based on a project work plan or proposal, it's very rare you see someone see a donor sort of turn around and say, actually, we don't want to change the program, just keep doing what you're doing for the next 24 months. So yeah, it's sort of being proactive and being willing to have those strong conversations and difficult conversations at times with donors is really important. And then the last part, I think you made a great point about the sort of data. And I know I said this to you in our run through yesterday, but we still haven't reached a sort of global consensus on what good data is. There is this sort of Western perception of the quality of data that should be collected that validates the results of a project. And that's inherently a Western principle, and I think there's a lot of good work being done that is sort of trying to show that the local expertise of peace builders can be captured in many different ways, and that data is incredibly rich and can tell us a sort of far greater story than many of the sort of project monitoring and evaluations plans that we end up seeing for the traditional donors. The next question is going to come from our friend Saurav at Alliance for Peacebuilding. Saurav, you are self-muted, but please feel free to ask your question live.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for this opportunity. Rebecca, thank you so much for doing this Q&A. And I also wanted to say thank you for your leadership in this field. I've really been inspired by your work. So my question to you is, for many peace building programs, the COVID-19 pandemic obviously influenced the need to adapt. What are some of the practices that you've seen used by peace building programs that have successfully adapted to this pandemic context? And also, what are factors that have enabled the success?
Great question, Sarav, and thanks. I'm always super excited to contribute back to the field and have these conversations with folks. I think, as we all know, it's been an unprecedented year and really difficult for everyone, especially in the context in which we do peace building programming. Some of the great adaptations I've seen is leveraging what's been happening in the kind of international mediation and dialogue field. There's been a lot of tools and resources, some that have been created by MIT and other programs that do have kind of a Western foundation in terms of the technology, but have been applied to a variety of different contexts of facilitating online discussions, and where access to people may have been limited, but there was sufficient connectivity. It's been a really creative adaptation to leverage lessons learned, from programming that was existing before COVID, and how we can create community and really enable and responsibly and with conflict sensitivity moderate difficult conversations with the people that we're serving in our peace building programming, if that is an applicable part of an activity. I think another good adaptation that I've seen is really leveraging, it's a model that I believe came from CDA collaborative learning projects, which is the Key People, More People matrix, and understanding who we're accessing and when and the level of influence that those people may have on a community. And so in places where we were still able to meet with communities, but it was the number of people we could meet with was restrictive, then leveraging that matrix to better understand and do a secondary assessment of, okay, we did some stakeholder mapping, we have a targeted audience, can we target even further? If we have to restrict who we're interacting with, can we do so intentionally? And who are the early emergent champions that we're working with? Who are the thought leaders in the community? Who are those that are typically marginalized, where it would be really impactful for them to continue to participate in something like this? And which audiences, because of COVID and the implications that it's had, would this type of meeting be increasingly burdensome to? And are there other creative ways to interact with those populations? And so that's been a great way to continue in-person meetings as and when necessary, but in a really safe way, and making sure that we're still we're not making those decisions ad hoc, but we're really being intentional and leveraging the data and information that we have about the context in which we're operating to adapt our programs. Other great tools I've seen is in the facilitation space and the use of some really, really great innovative whiteboarding and kind of just creative facilitation platforms. My organization uses Mural, M-U-R-A-L, and they have some pre-existing templates to use, and it's a great way to bring people together online to brainstorm about issues, to build things or prototype things, and have a bunch of different types of conversations. And these platforms have worked both internally to manage our own strategy and communication as we move forward in a remote operating world, as well as working with our partners. A couple of other, for those who use the Google for your email or platform, Google has one called Jamboard, J-A-M board, B-O-A-R-D. And then there's another one called Miro, M-I-R-O. And so there's a bunch of great options. Some of them are free, some of them require a subscription. They have different levels of complexity, but that's been another great resource and tool that has facilitated some creative and exciting adaptations to our programming amidst all of the challenges of a global pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's amazing sort of these whiteboard tools that have sort of emerged over the last sort of year. I use Jamboard quite a lot, and as you mentioned, Miro. I know some of you on the sort of webinar today have signed up for our new Connexus platform, and I find that when we're designing all these new platforms for the DME for Peace Plus community, and we map out the entire site on Miro, and I find it very visually helpful, particularly when you're working across teams and you can collaborate on. It's a great tool. And I hadn't heard of Mural before, so I'm gonna have to go check that one out.
I will say for folks who receive USAID funding or work with USAID colleagues, Mural is almost through FedRamp, which is the formal process that they need for technology to be approved for USAID stakeholders to use. So it's just worth noting if you're at the start of considering what type of application or platform you might use in this space, and you have a lot of USAID funded programming, that Mural might be the best option, just as an FYI.
Rebecca, you mentioned conflict sensitivity in your last answer, and a few of the questions that have come through the audience are sort of directly sort of asking about, adaptation and conflict sensitivity. So do you have any special considerations that you should take into account for, conflict sensitive adaptation? Any guiding principles that you look to in that regard?
Yeah, I think, and I know there's a book by this title, which is great, but as a larger principle, I really think when we're working in the peace building space, or honestly, anywhere in our work, that the founding principle really needs to be do no harm. And I don't think we mention that sometimes in our activity design, or that we take a conflict sensitive approach. And again, the same issue with, adaptations is we often don't spend the time reflecting during activity design, or dedicating the resources and buy-in, building the buy-in necessary to ensure that conflict sensitivity isn't just built in at activity design, but is monitored throughout implementation. And I know we can be really reticent to add additional indicators amidst donor requirements and everything else we maybe need to track. But I would argue that actually having one or two conflict sensitivity indicators, paired with or leveraging, context indicators that are looking at, responses to the community and, other indicators of conflict, tension, any of the other kind of push-pull factors that we look at in our work, that having a handful of those indicators embedded in your regular monitoring and evaluation strategy is paramount if we really truly want to implement conflict sensitive practices. We can definitely leverage observational data, and absolutely, we should be leveraging more informal channels of data. But I think the problem is that I've seen is too often in the field we rely solely on observational data, and we're not always paying enough attention to those factors around conflict sensitivity, and when we're not being conflict sensitive. And so I find that having conflict sensitive indicators is just a good reminder and quality assurance throughout our process that we will dedicate a level of attention consistently to conflict sensitivity. I think other things to be on the lookout for is how and when we're leveraging that informal data, and how we're building in regular feedback loops with the community. That should be informal. We may have formalized ones as well, but are enough people who need to make decisions on the program and who have oversight, are they also connected to feedback from the community? Is it not just the people who are running around and doing trainings or leading dialogue sessions or whatever kind of the implementation might be, but also the decision makers. Are we creating opportunities for them to interact with the community and get a more realized sense of what's happening on the ground? And I think a combination of that, of conflict sensitive indicators and in ensuring that we have informal feedback loops that are also accessible to decision makers can really help just strengthen our conflict sensitive practices and their application in ensuring that our programs do no harm.
I love those points. I think peace building organizations specifically sometimes take it for granted that conflict sensitivity is a guiding principle in our programming. So we think, oh yeah, we wrote it into the proposal. It's a part of what we're doing. When actually, the implicit nature of it is not good enough. We need to be explicit about it in the same way that we need to be explicit about sort of monitoring and evaluation. It needs to be a part of our program. We need to be very conscious of it. And I love that idea about feedback loops. It's like, how do you keep your eye on what's happening to ensure that you're constantly meeting those conflict sensitive principles? I think those are two great pieces of advice. To our audience, a reminder that we'd love to hear your voice. I know some of you guys are typing questions, but if you want to share with the entire community, you can click on the hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone. Otherwise, you can keep typing your questions and we will continue asking Rebecca. So Rebecca, you've worked with a wide range of organizations, from sort of small local organizations to sort of slightly bigger like Nuru to large organizations like Search and Social Impact. What do you think is the main difference in how sort of smaller and larger organizations in working in conflict affected contexts, what do you think is the biggest difference in how they adapt their programming or how they use data?
I actually think I have found that it's harder for large organizations to institute kind of the practices necessary to support adaptation and learning than it is for smaller organizations. I think smaller organizations that are still figuring things out necessarily lean into learning to problem solve when they come across gaps. You oftentimes have smaller teams that are in more regular communication. And I think as organizations grow, they build in necessary sometimes levels of bureaucracy to support compliance and all of the different systems that support larger organizational development and in structures and systems that help us do our jobs. But I think when you have too many levels of management or bureaucracy, we're constantly playing a game of telephone. So the urgency and the validity of the data that we're seeing at the field level that may indicate the importance of making an adaptation, by the time that gets up to an authorized decision maker in a larger organization, has maybe lost its gusto, its impact and level of import, and it's viewed at just like any other kind of decision that needs to be made. And so I think the point I made to the last question applies here as well, of giving authorized decision makers and people at higher levels of management, making sure that they have opportunities to be connected to the programming that's happening on the ground. And for field-based organizations that are also quite large, the same thing applies, right? Just really understanding some of the activities that are happening and having more regular glimpses into what's working and not working and the learning that's happening. I've found with some of the larger organizations that I've worked with, pause and reflect meetings across whole portfolios have been wildly effective in really grounding a lot of the learning that's happening, sharing joint learning across teams, and really bringing a more collective and collaborative atmosphere to adaptations and making decisions. And actually, Jack, I didn't give you a heads up about this beforehand, but there's a link on Headlight Consulting Services website. We have a resource hub, and we actually just posted a few months ago a guide, a really short guide to hosting and designing pause and reflect meetings. And so that might be a useful resource if that sounds like something that might help your organization or an organization that you work with. I think, other useful practices is, that kind of preemptive, proactive nature that I was talking about earlier with donors, and having that instituting that in your organization as well, right? If you have multiple layers of bureaucracy, doing some internal expectation setting around feedback loops, around conflict sensitivity, and what's quote unquote good enough data for decision making or adaptations. That's really helpful practices to have both internally and with donors. So I think those are some of the keys as organizations get larger, to make sure that we're not leaning too heavily just on the lines of communication and decision-making structures established through the more bureaucratic structures of an organization.
I think that's a really, really good answer. Before I joined Search, I worked in US campaign politics, and I worked for a couple of startups. And I don't think we ever had a question around compliance. I think we just always did. My old CEO, who is very heavily involved in democratic politics, used to say that we operated working on a pizza box mentality, in that we were still like a startup, constantly, iterating and adapting every single day. And I think that sometimes worked in our favor and sometimes to our detriment. So I think it's interesting as you transition to a different organization, one with a bit more structure. Like I felt in those startup situations, I was able to respond immediately and sort of start a project tomorrow. Whereas, if I was to do it at Search, it would take time. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing, because I have a lot of bad ideas, so I need people to criticize. We need to sort of have some feedback sessions. Yeah, there's definitely a sort of a fine balance between efficiency and efficacy and sort of, the rollout or rapid response. So Rebecca, as we get towards the end of today's discussion, I've posted the link to the resource on the Pause and Reflect workshop guide in the chat box for everyone. But I was wondering, are there any simple steps or any sort of best practices or top tips that you'd like to share with our audience on like how to improve their programming or adapt their programming for maximum impact? I know you've shared so many already, but just any you may have missed, or any that didn't pop up in any of your answers so far.
Yeah, I think, Jack, I had shared with you the Knowing When to Adapt resource from USAID. If you want to share that with everyone, USAID came up with a decision tree tool that's based on knowing when to adapt. And it has, I think it's applicable for those, who are outside of the USAID universe, absolutely. Some of the rhetoric or language might be a little bit off, but I think you can see your way through it beyond anything that might be USAID specific language to just a really helpful glimpse at a process with some leading questions to understand when it might be appropriate to make an adaptation, and how to move from conversations around what the evidence is saying and identifying what the adaptation should be to actually implementing it. And I think those would be some of my kind of parting tips. Sometimes it can be an uphill battle, at least where we are now in some of our donor relations and even internally with our organizations, to even draw attention for the need to make an adaptation. But I think sometimes once we've agreed that there's a need, we can lose steam in actually implementing the adaptation, or just assume that the adaptation that we make will naturally make the programming better. And as we all know, we're humans and we're fallible, and we're learning more from the communities that we're working with every day. And sometimes our first adaptation isn't a success and doesn't improve the programming. Maybe we misunderstood something in the data, or we didn't have enough information on a particular aspect. And so I think, my parting thing is really, approach this as iterative. that this is actually just good project management. It's not an add-on, it's not a plus up, it shouldn't be viewed as an additional burden. I think our ability to understand our operating context and be diligent in ensuring that we have enough information to understand them on an ongoing basis, and then having the strength and fortitude to have difficult conversations around when something isn't going as we expected, no matter the rationale, right? Whether there was a flaw in activity design, or there was a significant change in the context in which we're operating. Having the fortitude to have those difficult conversations and identify what needs to be changed, and then really making sure that we're rallying together and coming at our work with a collaborative spirit to make those adaptations, and then be honest with ourselves about whether or not they're working. It's all an iterative process. We really need to re-embed some of these learning and adaptation practices and attitudes back into just traditional program management, and view learning as an essential piece of the accountability matrix that we often are forced to reflect, or the lens that we're forced to look at our programming through. So I know that's a tall order, but it does work. I've seen really just tremendous adaptations and learning, and there's a shift in culture in a lot of the spaces in which I'm working and I'm honored to be a part of, and it is possible. So I would just encourage you all, don't lose hope if the first adaptation fails. Don't lose hope if the first time you see an issue you're not able to convince leadership. It really is worth our effort to make sure that the work that we're doing is the best that it can be, and that it really is serving the communities that we're working with and their needs. And that takes a lot more honesty and learning and adapting and changing what we're doing than even 50, 60 plus years into doing development and peace building in a more formalized way. Then I think we're always willing to admit. But I'll admit it here, at least from my end, and encourage you all to do the same.
I think that's a great way to wrap up today's conversation, Rebecca. I think everybody on this call and everybody who works in this field ultimately wants to make the greatest positive impact possible to the communities within which we work. And in order to do that, we need to be regular in our adaptation to understand what's working, what's not, to make changes and make decisions that ultimately will maximize our positive impact. I've shared the resources, the decision tree, the pause and reflect guide. I think it's worth checking out, everybody on today's call, the Headlight Consulting Services resource page. It's really great. The blog is a regular search of mine as I seek guidance on how to do a lot of this work myself. So yeah, please check it out, and please share any resources that you might have. What are, to our audience, like what are the go-to resources when you're thinking about how to adapt? I'd love to see them. Please share. So as we wrap up today, I want to thank Rebecca for sharing your expertise and insights with us. This was a really fun conversation, and I'm really just delighted to as we close out this effective interrelated building program, bring Rebecca back into the fold, having been so heavily involved during your time at Search. I really appreciate it, and I know our audience do too.
Yeah, best of luck closing out the program, and I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your week. And please, Jack, feel free to share my email address. If anything that I mentioned today was of interest or you have more questions, I really am truly always happy to help out. So feel free to email me, and we can have a conversation, and I'll share any additional resources I can identify with you.
Great, thank you, Rebecca, and to our audience, thank you for joining today's webinar. This is the second in our series. This recording will be posted online on our media gallery later today, so please return to it and feel free to share with your colleagues, kick off a discussion. This webinar series is going to continue next week. It'll be the final webinar in the Ask an Expert series. We'll be joined by Kat Howe, who is the Senior Advisor on Organizational Learning at the Global Knowledge Initiative, and Jenny Nolte of Pivot Data Design. And we're going to be discussing how to effectively communicate the results of your programming. So how do we move beyond the traditional 70-page evaluation, and how do we get people the information they need in an accessible and digestible way? So if you want to register for that webinar, and I know many of you already have, the link is in your chat box. A final thing to mention, a note from the community, the JLI Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Hub is launching a new compendium of stories of change. This highlights monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning partnerships between international and local faith actors. Here is a link to register for that discussion. And again, that is in your chat box right now. Thank you everybody for your patience as I send you a billion links. I hope you're able to participate in some of these discussions. I hope to see you next week for the final webinar in our series. Thank you again to Rebecca. Thank you again to the GHR Foundation for your continued support of this program. And I look forward to seeing you all online at 9 a.m. on the 26th of January. Okay, take care everyone, and talk to you soon.